Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am privileged yet saddened to rise to honor my former boss, my mentor, and my friend, Robert Sopuck. And I thank all my colleagues for allowing the indulgence in honoring this great Canadian, the former Member of Parliament for Dauphin, Swan River, and Neepawa. Robert, or Bob, as he was known by his many, many friends, passed away suddenly but peacefully last week in his home near Lake Audie, Manitoba. He is survived by his beloved wife, Carolyn, 2 children, Tony and his wife, Lainey, his daughter, Marcia, and husband, Graham, and 3 grandchildren that he simply loved to teach about the outdoors, Eden, Senan, and Esme. By his sister, Joyce, and brother, Tim, by many nieces and nephews, and by so many other loved ones across the country that simply cherished Bob. I want to offer, on behalf of the Conservative Party, our appreciation to Bob's family for sharing him with us. Particularly his beloved wife, who we often refer to so proudly as the inestimable Carolyn. His love for you serves as an inspiration for all of us that have been lucky enough to witness it. Mr. Speaker, today I hope to do justice to a great parliamentarian, a great man. And I apologize in advance. I may get emotional. Well, I have some family with us today. My wife and I were married, but we had our big wedding celebration on Saturday where we were expecting Bob and Carolyn to be with us. Back in 2016, I was hired by Bob after a very robust interview process where I went to his office and we talked about life and politics for about 2 hours over a scotch.
Yep.
He cared about the person, not the resume.
Yep.
And little did I know at that time the profound impact that he would have on my life. Bob was described by a newspaper that he surely never read, the Toronto Star, as the right-wing environmentalist, which is actually a very good way to describe him. But he wasn't an environmentalist, Mr. Speaker. He was a conservationist. He believed that those who live, work, and play on the land are our best conservationists and the true environmentalists. He recognized the value of modern agriculture, of ranching, of natural resource development, and all of the rural communities that those industries support. And he was an avid outdoorsman, a true conservationist himself, and perhaps the strongest advocate that hunters, anglers, and trappers in Canada have ever had. Bob was born to parents of Eastern European descent and immigration, and while he was raised in the city, he spent his summers in the Whiteshell, where he learned his love of the outdoors. He caught his first fish at the age of 4 with his father, which kicked off a life of outdoor pursuits. Bob went on to receive an honors degree in science from the University of Manitoba, and then a master's of fishery science from Ivy League school, Cornell University, with a particular focus on rainbow trout. And from there, he held a wide variety of careers in land, water, and wildlife conservation. He worked as a fisheries biologist at both the provincial and federal levels before he decided he wanted to purchase a beautiful, sprawling piece of farmland near Lake Audie, just south of his beloved national park, Riding Mountain National Park, where he went on to, with his own hands, build a beautiful, secluded log home. He spent a lot of time in the Arctic, did a lot of work in the Arctic, focusing on Arctic char research, and had so many amazing stories and such respect for the people that he had the chance to live with, the Inuit. He did some of the earliest environmental impact research on the long-proposed Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, and I think one of his greatest regrets is that pipeline never came to fruition. He was a farmer. He was a guide. He was an outfitter. He was former Premier of Manitoba, Gary Filmon's environmental advisor. He went on to be the environmental director at the Pine Falls paper plant, improving water quality quantitatively. He worked for Delta Waterfowl, and after retiring from this place, returned as a board member there. He did environmental monitoring in the oil sands. He understood policy because his boots were on the ground. He often joked when somebody would introduce him to do a speech, reasonable to think, can't this guy keep a job? But those jobs and those experiences formed his views on conservation, on natural resource development, and the rural way of life. And I list this depth of careers because it highlights that he earned his stripes, that allowed him to be an incredible advocate and an even better member of Parliament. Bob was a brilliant communicator, and he knew how important effective communications were, that words matter. He was brilliant, not because he was suave, some fast-talking salesman type guy, because he was authentic. He was honest, he was thoughtful, he was direct, he was articulate, and had a heck of a vocabulary on him. He was wicked smart, and he always preferred to stand up for the little guy. He wasn't willing to just lay down to the mobs, to the loud minority that want to shout down views like his at times. It was an inspiration when he so proudly and so frequently stood up and boldly said, bluntly, what needed to be said. And he's been doing it for decades, Mr. Speaker. Starting back in 2001, Bob wrote a regular column with the Winnipeg Free Press where he refused to shy away from issues like hunting and angling in Canada. Those essays beautifully articulated the spirituality and connection to family and nature that so many millions of Canadians enjoy today. And he explained why so many of us feel that it is vital to protect the rights of those people and their ability to take part in those traditional heritage activities. He went on to compile these essays into a wonderful book, A Life Outdoors, which, looking back when I was reading it last night, I think is an unintentional biography, listing his story since he was catching that first fish with his dad at 4, throughout his life as that avid outdoorsman. And it's a wonderful book. I would encourage anybody to pick it up, particularly if you enjoy outdoor activities, and has some just phenomenal recipes for wild game that I can assure you I've tasted and are very, very good. Bob had the chance to elevate those communication skills and decided to run for office back in 2010. And he ran because he knew that he had something to offer. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to fight for what he believed in, and that's what he did in this place every single day of his 9 years as the Member of Parliament. Bob had an incredible understanding that I was so lucky to have witnessed as to what this job is. The first is obviously to represent our local communities, to fight for them, to advocate for them, and try to get things done for them, something that each and every one of us in this house works to do. But the second is to do what's right for Canada, the big picture country that has diverse views and many challenges at times, but to fight for what is right and to fight with that same level of passion that he did for the communities that he so proudly represented. He knew his constituents. He knew their way of life, their values, their struggles, their challenges, their hopes, their dreams, and their aspirations. He had the benefit that he had worked in politics in his early days with the Manitoba government, as had his wife, Carolyn, which allowed him to be all the more effective. He knew when to be loud, when it made sense to pick a fight, to do it publicly, to try to move the needle on something, or when it made more sense to keep it behind the scenes, to try to quietly get things done. He knew to keep it on the ice, and that's why he was so respected and liked by colleagues from across party lines. Locally, he was so proud to have helped deliver funding to get Highway 10 through Riding Mountain National Park paved. And anybody that knows or lives in the area and commutes through there knows how important that was. And anybody that has the chance to go and visit that beautiful national park is a benefactor of the work he did lobbying to get that done. As have anyone that has benefited from funding through the Recreational Fisheries Conservation Partnership Program. Now, the program was launched back in 2013 and supported fisheries habitat restoration projects led by recreational angling groups, by fisheries groups, by conservation groups. There are lakes across Canada right now where spawning habitat has been restored, where aerators have been installed, and anglers will reap the benefits today, tomorrow, and for the years ahead. And just as Bob wanted, it was done with the people that care so much about the natural world, that will get in hip waders, will get in the water, and want to make meaningful impacts on our fishery stocks. He knew that those were the best people. They wanted to get things done. They didn't just want to talk about doing things. They put their money where their mouth is. Now, through perseverance, persuasion, and perhaps just sheer stubbornness, he was able to convince former Finance Minister Flaherty and Prime Minister Harper to enable this plan, and is a forever lasting legacy for the projects that it undertook. It would never have happened without Bob Sopuck, and I would go so far as to argue that Bob Sopuck has actually saved more fish in this country than anybody else single-handedly ever has. And throughout his career, he was an effective, a long-time member of the Fisheries Committee and loved every minute of it. And I think his colleagues appreciated him there too. That committee was always, I think still always is, rather cordial with many unanimous reports. But he was also on the Environment Committee, which at times is a little less polite. Bob was a pit bull. Given his Ivy League education, his immense series of careers prior to being elected, not many people were going to best him at any topic at those two committees. And that included the bureaucrats who I remember once telling Bob, whenever you're there, we know that we have to be on our toes. And he was so very proud of that. And he just reveled in the opportunity to rip apart some pompous executive who thought they could get away with saying things that weren't actual answers when he knew, and he would fight to get them, and he would run circles around them. Now I'm a proud member of the Environment Committee. And the lessons I've learned could not be more clear. And I think some of those officials now know where I learned it from. And I have to mention the Fisheries Act specifically because Bob wrote a paper back in 2001 entitled The Federalization of Prairie Freshwater, which was the policy framework used by the Harper government when making important changes to the Fisheries Act. It was 10 years after he wrote it that the catalyst for those changes finally happened. It was overland flooding in Saskatchewan. It was the Craven Country Jamboree threatened due to excess rain, a campground that was unable to be pumped because DFO declared that, well, there's water there now, so clearly fish could be there, there's habitat, so we have to prevent that. Normal person logic says, well, that's not really fish habitat, it's a campground, but it was the definition of fish habitat in the Act that was the problem. Bob knew it, identified it years earlier, and he went on to lead the charge drafting that legislation to make those important changes to stop ridiculous overreach from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that had real impact on rural Canadians and our prosperity. He understood that unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats had to be checked, that they didn't understand our way of life, that he had to be involved in educating them on that. Bob was the founder of our Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus with the help of his close friend, the member for Red Deer Lacombe. That member has carried the torch ever since, and I know for a fact he will not only keep Bob's legacy alive, but he will be the steadfast advocate that that community needs and will continue to work on their behalf. And he's joined by so many of my Conservative colleagues, such as the member for North Okanagan Shuswap, who are dedicated to protecting these communities. And there are so many more, and you know who you are, and it is appreciated. There are millions of law-abiding firearms owners in this country, of hunters, of anglers, of people who contribute directly to enhancing our wildlife populations. And as Bob would always say, are the environment's best friends. Now, you wouldn't think that communities like this necessarily need protecting, but unfortunately they do. And for the most part, rural Canadians don't really care what happens in big cities. They just kind of want to be left alone. But for some reason, many of those radical environmental and animal rights activists living in their concrete jungles have a real keen interest in what happens on our private landscapes. We need great MPs like Bob, like my colleagues, to continue to stand up for that, now in his honor. I'm proud to join those efforts and will continue to take part in any of those future fights. And when I think back some of the fights, he reveled a good fight. One I remember he led the charge on, which was important. It was Bill C-246. It was an animal rights bill that would transfer animal rights, human rights to animals. And what it was going to do, it was going to destroy modern agriculture, animal livestock agriculture. It was going to destroy hunting and angling in this community. And he led with the help of across party lines, using those relationships that he'd built by being the guy that he was to kill that legislation. I remember when the RCMP decided to try to appease those animal rights activists and get rid of the iconic muskrat hat for Mounties. Bob was having none of that. He wanted to protect the livelihood of those trappers across the country and the warmth of our frontline police officers serving in our northern communities. He walked the walk, and he was a true friend of the trapping community. And many of you may remember him strutting around here with a fur-laden jacket, with his own muskrat hat, and these big old skunk mitts. He was the real deal. And Bob was always on the lookout for government overreach or efforts that would impact the people that he was sent here to represent, which is why he was great, because he wasn't just about defending. He was vocal in supporting and promoting, proactively working to set the stage, to communicate with the average person that otherwise might not think about these issues or even realize they care about them. In many cases, urban audiences, like when he was writing for the Winnipeg Free Press. What might be less known is the impact that he's had on so many people directly, personally, individually, and particularly the young people. And I think it's important to highlight the legacy that leaves behind. Bob freely shared his wisdom, his wealth of knowledge with young people around him. Understanding that it's not just about today, that it's about tomorrow, and anything he could do to nurture the next generation, he was willing to do. He was a mentor to so many of us, to those that worked directly for him, and to our friends that he just got to know, that he would spend time with, that he would give generously his time of. And each and every one of us loved him. He gave so much time just sitting down. He would answer questions candidly, provided advice when asked, and sometimes when not asked. He would share his life experiences and those incredible stories that he'd amassed over that wonderful life of his. He treated us like part of the team, or the family, which is why I think he was referred to by Uncle Bob by so many people. He made us believe that we actually had something to contribute, that we mattered. I know I'm going to miss some names from the list, but I want to give a bit of a scale of some that have been impacted. I think of Duncan, Brett, Michael, Blake, Olivier, Jay, Megan, and the Sims boys, just to name a few. Just like him, he wanted us to be authentic and to be humble. He wanted us to be proud of where we were, what we were doing, and where we were going, and what it meant. Simply put, he wanted each one of us to believe in ourselves and made that a little bit easier. He loved telling stories, and he had so many profound statements. I don't know what to call them other than Bobisms. And I can think back of a couple, one of which was, I quote, "I take the view that if you give up fat, sugar, and alcohol too, you may not live longer, it will just feel that way." But on a more serious note, the quote was, "Life is about chapters. You have to turn the page on one before you can start the next. And nothing lasts forever, and nothing stays the same." He lived in the now. He wasn't one for birthdays or arbitrary reasons to celebrate. He preferred milestones and achievements. He espoused sharing stories of the past, not living them, of looking to the future, but not dwelling on it, to enjoy the moment, and to be proud and happy with where you are, to be rational, to be thoughtful, to ask questions, and to act with purpose, and to recognize that the best way to achieve success was to do it with passion, to embrace the challenge in front of you, and to find the opportunity within it. When Bob retired, our relationship didn't just stop like you'd expect with many bosses and their employees. He called in regularly to catch up. I'd go visit Bob and Carolyn at the farm. He was the first to pledge a donation when I called him with the crazy idea I was going to run for politics. He was the one that had introduced me at my nomination campaign launch. He's been by my side since the day we met, and I will forever appreciate his friendship like I know so many others do. And the best part is I'm not unique. There are so many others. I'm part of a massive group of people whom he has meant more to than he could ever know. Bob, I'm going to miss you. I thought we had more calls. I thought we had more visits to the farm ahead of us. But I will be forever grateful for all you've done for me. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to share a quote from one of Bob's favorite writers, Henry David Thoreau. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn from what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." You lived, Bob, and you lived well. You were a great Canadian, and you will live on in all of us that had the privilege to know you. I can't think of any higher achievement, any higher recognition of a life well lived than having those who know you proudly say, after you're gone, "We lost one of the good ones, but I'm happy I knew him." You achieved that, Bob. We will miss you, and we will never forget you. Davis.
Before we move to questions and comments, I think it would be appropriate to say that when I was a new MP, I was thoroughly impressed with Bob Sopuck's quick smile, those ruddy cheeks that framed by that silver white beard, and a firm handshake and a welcome to Parliament Hill. And as the honourable member said so well, he will be missed. The Honourable Leader of the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to be very brief, Bob Sopuck, I didn't know before the actual by-election in which he was successful in getting elected. Him and I were elected at the same time, and shortly thereafter. He does have a very strong personality. A personality that kind of sticks with you, the manner in which he conveys his thoughts. And I always thought of him as a great outdoorsman, someone that truly understood the benefits of having a healthy environment and the benefits of that, whether it's nature of the land or our waters. And I had a deep amount of respect for the fact that he was, from my perspective, I would classify him as a true conservative, but a conservative that could really express himself in such a way in which you respect the gentleman that he is and just his attitude. I did want to give my condolences to Carolyn and the family, and know that he will be dearly missed and in the prayers of many of his former constituents and Manitobans, families, and friends. I was really touched by the members' comments in regards to Bob, and I just want to take the opportunity just to wish the family and friends well and give them our prayers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Portage Lisgar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for the kind words, and I will pass those wishes along to the family who I suspect might be watching right now too, and it is appreciated. And then you touched on something that I do find quite interesting. Bob always talked about the fact that conservation and conservative are obviously the same root word, and he was the biggest believer and defender of the fact that conservatives have nothing to be ashamed for when it comes to the environment, that the greenest prime minister in Canadian history, as voted, was Brian Mulroney. His focus was always on outcomes, though. It's not process. I think it drove him up a wall when there was more of a concern on how do we get to where we're going rather than actually getting to where we're going. That focus on outcomes, I think, would serve us all well in our lives, but more broadly in government. Government's this big behemoth that often, as Bob always said, doesn't understand many of the facets of our way of life. And that's why it's so vital that we step up and defend them and fight as true environmentalists for a better, healthier planet based on metrics of improved biodiversity, of wetland habitat, of fishery stocks. That's what I'm going to continue to fight for, and I thank the honourable member.
Then I have
questions and comments. The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to congratulate the member for Portage Lisgar for his touching homage. I think we were all touched by his words today, and offer to him and to the friends and family of Mr. Robert Sopuck our most sincere condolences on behalf of Quebecers and all the people that we represent. Certainly all of our condolences. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Mr. Sopuck, as I was only elected in 2019, but from what I've understood this morning, I think I really would have liked to have met him. He seems to have been a good model of engagement. You know, he's been talked about as being an environmentalist of the right. That's not something we hear about every day. I think we need more people like him, people who have a sense of duty, as I heard from the words of the member for Portage Lisgar, defending those who have less influence. I certainly agree with that. The role of an MP is to fight for their people, to represent them with pride, and, you know, I certainly agree with that, and to lead battles and to know how to choose, Mr. Speaker. And this is a challenge that I think that all 338 members of the House of Commons have to face every day, of knowing how to discern between the battle you have to to lead in public and the work you have to do in private. And I think that certainly a lot of work can be done behind the scenes, and it can lead to results. I think I would have really appreciated knowing Mr. Sopuck. And I'm a blockist from Quebec, and I'm talking about a Conservative member from Manitoba, and I've just found a number of points in common. So let's always be aware, Mr. Speaker, that we have much more in common than we might think most of the time, and I would invite all of us to work together to advance files and improve things for society, for the common good, and I'm persuaded that my colleague from Portage Lisgar will agree with me on that. And once again, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois and of all of our elected members and all the people we represent, our sincere condolences. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Portage Lisgar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for the well wishes. Bob would have agreed with you. In particular, he had a fondness for Quebec, actually, because Quebec has a very high rate of firearms ownership. They have a love of the outdoors, of quadding, of sledding, of doing all the modern and traditional heritage activities. And he always felt, I think, a strong connection with many people in Quebec. And I think that's why he was focused on Canada broadly and on so many individuals that share his views. I could not be more proud, and I could only aim and hope to achieve half of what that man ever has. And I thank you once again.
The honourable member from Edmonton Strathcona.
Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his speech today. It was very touching to hear the words that he had from about his former colleague. And while I didn't have the pleasure of working with the late Mr. Sopuck, I have heard many things from my colleagues within the lobby. Many people have very, very funny stories about their time working with him. And I do have to acknowledge that I think there were very few times that the late Mr. Sopuck and the NDP saw eye to eye. But I think one of the things that New Democrats appreciated about Mr. Sopuck was the fact that he was an avid outdoor enthusiast who championed the rural way of life. As part of his enthusiasm, he was also a dedicated conservationist. As someone who comes to this place on the heels of Linda Duncan, another important conservationist in this House, I know that was very important to the New Democrats. That devotion to a rural way of life endeared him to many across party lines. And so on behalf of the New Democratic Party, I'd like to extend my condolences to his family, to his friends, and I'd like to ask the member to share some more stories of this late member. Thank you.
The honourable member from Portage Lisgar.
Thank you for the kind words. And yeah, Bob probably didn't get along with every NDP MP, and certainly would happily disagree on many policy issues. But I will give an example of one that wasn't the case. It's former MP Finn Donnelly, who I had the privilege of joining on occasion with the two of them for a scotch and a across the lines political, candid, Chatham House Rules conversation, because that was the type of guy Bob was. You couldn't understand necessarily why they got there, but you should probably sit down and ask them to understand why people feel the way they do. And that's what made him a brilliant communicator for different audiences, particularly those urban audiences that he worked with during his time at the Free Press. And I know Bob will regret, I think he still owed Finn a couple of bottles of scotch from a couple of bets that did not go his way. So I think he will hopefully be forgiven for that, but I know I enjoyed many opportunities with some of your former colleagues.
An honourable member who knew him well, the honourable member from Red Deer Lacombe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague and friend from Portage Lisgar. You know, it's just kind of funny as an Alberta MP that's been here for quite some time. Two of my best friends in the time that I've been here have actually been Bob Sopuck and Candice Bergen, the MP that my colleague has just replaced. I guess people back home might be questioning my Alberta credentials right now, but don't worry about that. Those are still intact. But Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I look back on, and I of course express my condolences to Caroline and the entire family, but Bob and I actually spent a lot of time here together, and he did put the meat on the bones of the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus. He actually came here and galvanized that. I was here a little bit before him, and we became instant friends because of our like-minded views of the world. I grew up on a beef ranch in Alberta, loved hunting and fishing. I spent my time as a as an outdoorsman as well, as a conservation officer, as a national park warden, as a fisheries technician for Alberta Fish and Wildlife, working on walleye. We just became fast friends, and I was able to spend a little bit of time in his riding. He was able to spend a little bit of time in my riding. We did a little bit of hunting and fishing together, and the Sims boys were there for one of the best duck hunts I've ever been on in my life was with Bob Sopuck, and oh my God, these canvasbacks were coming in. They were going 100 miles an hour, jinking all over the place. We couldn't hit anything. I'll openly admit that. I think we probably fired 100 rounds of shotgun shells. I think we came back with 3 ducks. So, but we had a lot of fun, and he was a great guy. And I'm beside myself. I'm gonna miss Bob, because we stayed in touch on a regular basis. He didn't just come and go and did his thing and left, but he cared. He still cared. And I was so, I was so angry when he left, because I kind of felt like I lost half of the duo, right? But I'm so glad that he did now, because you never know how much time you're going to have. And I'm glad that he actually was able to spend those years back on that beautiful log house on the farm, and with Caroline, and spend that time there. But one of the things I loved about Bob was he would always find a way to defend rural folk. And as a guy that grew up on a cow-calf operation, he would defend beef farmers as some of the best environmentalists that we have. They're often under attack, and I'm wondering if my colleague would elaborate on just how well Mr. Sopuck would defend cattle ranchers in this great country.
The honourable member from Portage Lisgar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Red Deer Lacombe. You guys were as close as you can get here. And you are a true Albertan, but I think Manitobans appreciate having you in our back pocket a little bit here. You know, Bob cherished those hunts, those days on the lake with you and with so many other people. That's where he was happy. And on that beautiful sprawling farm that he had, he managed the landscape. He was a gardener of his little piece of earth. And that was the way he thought. He wanted more ducks, maybe a hippocar next time, but he wanted more available at very least. And he took action to do so. When I was working for him, we made a video called If You Care About the Environment, Eat Canadian Beef. It didn't seem that controversial, but did get a bit of a pushback. I guess it was the first time I really learned that many animal rights activists are kind of sociopaths. He kind of warned me about that. But a lot of the comments of death threats and suggestions of ways he should go die online that I had to, with pre-advanced current tools of hiding, were telling. But he did it with such pride. He knew that ranchers are our best boots on the ground, that they're important to maintaining our natural grasslands and our rural communities. I couldn't tell you how many of those types of groups I would argue that he is the best friend that they could have ever had. From hunters, anglers, trappers, ranchers, every other type of agricultural producer, and so many others. But it was always grounded by his belief in the rural way of life, in protecting it, maintaining it, fighting for it, and he was one of the best there ever could be at it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank all members for participating in touching a tribute to a former member and the one who touched so many people here. And we wish Carolyn and his family and all his friends the solace of having so many memories with him.